Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, as this webinar about benchmarking for facility management professionals. Peter Kimmel will discuss the success factors and pitfalls of benchmarking, and I'm very happy that we were able to ask him to give this webinar. Peter is in the field of FM benchmarking already for years. He is the principal of FM benchmarking. You can find the website also if you want to check it out. I can highly recommend it. He's also publisher of FM Link, where you can find very interesting articles and news items about facility management. He also wrote a book about FM benchmarking, an ebook. You can download that. Everybody that is going to listen this webinar will receive an email with a link where you can find the ebook. And also at the end of this presentation, you will see a link where to find this book. The slides will also be sent to everybody that attended the webinar. And if you did sign up, but you couldn't make it for some reason, you will also receive both the record of the webinar and also the slides. So welcome, very welcome, Peter Kimmel. I'm very curious to hear your story, and I will hand over the word to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Rensky. And today I want to say first good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining me in this webinar. And I want to make a slight correction to what Rensky said. The ebook is not about FM benchmarking, which is my company, but rather just about benchmarking for facility professionals. So it is totally generic. It was put out actually by the IFMA Foundation. So you will get a copy of it or see how to get a copy at the end of the webinar. And Rensky will send you a link on how to download it yourselves if you need it. So the first thing I thought I would do is share with you what I'm hoping that you will learn today. I'm going to be covering a lot of materials and show you a lot of examples. Each of the items on this slide can impact what people can expect from benchmarking and whether or not they'll be successful. We're going to be talking about them throughout the webinar today. So the first thing is that a lot of people think that benchmarking is not really for them because of perceived lack of data security. That is one of the misconceptions about benchmarking. Yes, security is very important, but there are certain things you can do to ensure that the data that you put in will be successful and your company data will be protected. We will talk about that. A second kind of thing is that people think that they need to have a lot of buildings in the benchmarking tool from their own city or from their own country. Again, that's a good thing to have, but you don't have to, and I'll show you why and how you can get around that. So we'll look at those and some other misconceptions as well. Second, we're going to look at 6 critical components of benchmarking to make sure that your implementation is successful. So we'll go through those, and then which pitfalls get in the way to be successful. This is from our experience, and it'll hopefully help you become have a really good benchmarking experience. And the last thing I'm hoping you will learn today is how you can go from the basics of just comparing your data to those of others or other buildings to actually improving your building performance. So to do that, you'll see how we incorporate best practices into benchmarking analytics. So at this point, I'm going to turn off the webcam. Hopefully you've seen enough of me, and I'd rather you focus on the screen so we can make the screens as large as possible. And I want to start off by going over a definition of benchmarking. It's a very simple definition, namely the use of a standard by which a metric can be measured or judged. It's only a line and a half long, but there's a lot of information that is in this definition. What metrics do you need to measure? How do they get measured? To which other buildings do you compare your buildings so you can be sure you're comparing apples to apples? These are some of the big things that relate to this definition, and we will examine all the key variables during this presentation. So today's agenda, the very first part of it is really we're going to go through who can benefit from benchmarking, who the stakeholders are, and how can they benefit. Then we're going to talk about the successful what the key components that are required for you to be successful, and then give examples of, we're going to go through several sets of examples, but this set is the value of filters, so you can compare apples to apples, make sure your building's compared to the right other buildings. Then some of the pitfalls that get in the way. Then we're going to show you how to really go to the next level and improve your benchmarking results through use of best practices. Examples of that. And then at the very end, I'll tell you just a little bit about FM benchmarking and give you a link so you can find out more. And then there will be some Q&A. And I do encourage you to use the chat box on your system and ask a lot of questions. They'll be answered at the end. Unfortunately, I don't think that the questions will be part of the recording, but you can ask them and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So the very first part of this presentation today, of this webinar, is who can benefit from benchmarking and how. Namely, who are the stakeholders? And I've got four primary groupings of stakeholders. The first two are the ones we're going to focus on today. So we'll come back to them in a second. The other two I'll just mention briefly here. The associations or facilities management associations can compile data related to their members, generate research reports, and provide a very valuable service to their members. Educators have found that benchmarking can be a really great teaching tool to help students learn not just about benchmarking, but about facilities. And by going out there and benchmarking real buildings and talking to facility managers, they can get quite a bit of experience. But today we're going to focus on facility managers and the FM contractors, the outsourcing contractors, and also consultants. So let's look first at the facility manager group. Most facility managers are looking at benchmarking for one of the first two reasons, or often both of them, that you see on this page. These become objectives of the benchmarking exercise. So the first one, to look up a metric related to your building. For example, how many square meters per person apply to your building, related to how many people you're getting in your building. Or what is your kilowatt hour usage per square meter, or how many employees or maintenance employees per square meter. Another is then comparing those results, those metrics, to those from other similar buildings. That's items number 1 and item number 2 on this slide. But what I like the best is actually item number 3, which to me is very, very important. You have to do 1 and 2 first, but item number 3 is how can I take that information and improve my building performance from it. We will see how to do that, and that becomes a very key objective of benchmarking. Item number 4, justify your facilities budget. So you find out, for example, through a benchmarking tool, that if you were to implement a given best practice, such as perhaps adding sensors to your restrooms to turn on the lights or something like that, you can then show that your costs might be able to go down so much, and you can begin to justify to your management the expenditure for those sensors. Similarly, you can justify additional staff by showing that others that have more staff are actually running their building more efficiently. And the last benefit for facility managers, the major benefits, is to know when it might pay for you to actually increase your outsourcing or perhaps decrease it. So you can just make a cogent decision related to the benchmarking data in terms of how you use your outsourcing contractors. The second set of stakeholders, the contractors, the outsourcing contractors, and the consultants. The first item here basically means if you are demonstrating or can demonstrate that your clients are doing better through benchmarking in terms of spending less on their facilities or something like that than other companies, you've got great marketing material to show to potential additional clients. On the other hand, if your clients are not doing better, you can still get a win out of this because a good benchmarking tool can show you what you need to do to improve your results. So either way, you win with number one or number two. And you can also use benchmarking to justify your pricing, because if a client comes to you and says they know some other colleagues of theirs in other buildings who are paying less per square meter for maintenance or janitorial services, you can use the benchmarking data to show, oh, but those are a different kind of situation. Here is why, and this is why your pricing can be justified, and you go from there. And lastly, this can become a sales tool because a lot of potential clients are demanding benchmarking from their outsourcing contractors, and that way, obviously, you'll have a way to satisfy that part of their requirements. Okay, the next slide is a chart, and I will explain this to you, but what the purpose of it is to show you how benchmarking does save a lot of money in your operating expenses. So we're looking at benchmarking data over a 10-year period. Each of these vertical bars is taken at the end of the first year, second year, third year, and so on through 10 years. This is from data from our clients, and we're looking at the end of each year's period at the median performing client in our database, and it shows how much money in terms of a percent they were able to save in that previous year. So at the end of 1 year, the dark green line shows that the median client using this methodology was able to reduce their operating expenses by 6%. The dark green represents additional savings or new savings from each subsequent year. So in the second year, an additional 5% savings were actually realized by the median performing client, in addition to the 6% they've already identified. They get that again every year from here on out. So that's a total, as shown by the light green, of 11%. The 6% from the first year, 5% from the next year. We do that for each additional year until at the end of 10 years, the median company in the database has reduced operating expenses by 31%. That's a very nice savings. And you notice the dark green, with the annual additional savings, is always positive because you always find new things to do to save more money. And why is that? The answer really, there's two reasons for that. One is that nobody implements all the recommendations in any given year, so some of those get implemented the next year. It's up to you as the facility manager to decide which ones are most important to implement. And secondly, technology changes. So what might become a best practice that becomes worthwhile to do or cost effective to do may not have even existed a few years earlier. I remember when a best practice were incorporating CFLs instead of incandescent lights. And now we're putting in LEDs. We're now using handheld equipment to measure the equipment readings, your HVAC equipment readings. These are all things that were not available 10 years earlier. So technology does change, and that's why you do get savings each year. Of course, the largest savings are going to be in your first few years. Okay, now let's go to the next part of this webinar, which is to talk about what are the key components for successful benchmarking. And we're going to start off by going back to some of those misconceptions I spoke about. I'm going to identify two of them on this slide and then two more shortly thereafter. With all these benefits, some of these misconceptions can cause people not to start benchmarking. So I really want to address those for you. And hopefully you'll see that these are not reasons to not benchmark. So the first one of these is your concern, perhaps, that your data is not secure or kept private. And it is indeed very important to keep your data confidential and secure. You don't want others to see it. But good systems do not divulge data, even within your own company, unless that's the specific user who can access your system has permissions that you assign. So a good tool should give you that capability. Now, if there is still a concern, a fail-safe method is for you to input your building names in as a code name, your building addresses as a code as well, and then nobody can figure it out. Okay, the next item or concern people have, maybe you've got a great tool, but it hardly has any buildings in the database. And this can be a real concern. My basic rule of thumb is you can never have enough buildings in your database. And why do we need enough buildings? And the reason is simple. It's so we can apply filters to compare apples to apples. So let me explain how that works. Let's hypothetically say we're studying energy consumption, and I give you a report that has 150 buildings and their median energy consumed. You then say, this is very interesting, but are these all office buildings? Because that's what my building is. And I say, no, they are not, but I can run that report by applying an office building filter, and it will end up with, instead of 150 buildings, it will end up with 80 buildings. The other 70, of course, are not office buildings. You then say, are these all open 24/7, every day of the week? Because that's what your building is. And I say, actually, no, they're not, but I can apply that filter. And we are now down to 30 buildings in our database. Excuse me. At the end of that, you tell me, well, you still want to apply more filters. And I say, well, it's really not a good idea to have a report that has fewer than 20 to 25 buildings in it, because then your results may not be meaningful. So we have a choice of either having to remove one of those previous filters we put in, or we can find a tool with a larger database. So the number of buildings in a database is a very valid concern. Let's look at examples of some other filters in a moment. But first, let me just show you examples of filters, which I'll do right here on this slide. And remember, you're going to get a copy of the PowerPoint deck so you can get everything on this slide and look at it at your leisure. But the first thing people often look for is, let me just look at buildings in my own city. So I see here country or city, or let me look for buildings in my own country. So that's this filter here. But there are other items on this list that are equally, if not more important, like the primary use. In that last example, we said office buildings, or it could be a manufacturing facility, or a hospital, or a school. Those are the primary use examples. We have some quality questions over here. Obviously, a building that is maintained to a high level of quality or is cleaned every day is going to cost more to operate than those that are done once a week. So the service quality level can be an important filter. Is the building open full time, 24/7? So that's the building hours over here on the left side. Or how many shifts per week is the building open for? That becomes an important filter. And these are all very obvious. Another one that's important is the building age. An older building generally costs more to operate than a newer building. So you can see there's lots of filters that can have an impact on your results. And quickly, your report that may have started with a database of several hundred or a few thousand buildings is going to be dwindled down to 20 to 25 in no time. So if we wanted to look at a workaround, we're studying the example on the last slide. We looked at energy consumption. Remember that example? Don't you think that we could get adequate comparisons by looking at buildings in the same climate as mine, even if they're not in the same city or country? And that way, we can get more buildings into our filter set. And then we can apply additional filters that we want to apply. So that is the general concept. We call that a workaround, and that is a great thing to have, so we don't just have to have a lot of buildings in the same city or country, especially if they're not a lot in the database to begin with. So we just can then expand our filter set by looking for other buildings in the same climate zone in that example. Now, that's not going to help us when we're studying security, but it's going to help us when we're studying energy consumption. We also see that we should turn off filters that we don't need, because it just will reduce the size of the filter set. So if we were looking at a security report, we would not need a filter that shows that we're in a snowy climate. So we can turn that filter off and put something else on instead. So let's come back to some more concerns. We already looked at data security, having enough buildings in the database. And now we have spoken or are speaking about the need to get buildings from your city or country. So I just showed you how having buildings in the same climate zone can be used to expand your filter set. Okay, let's look at some other types of metrics that people study. If you're looking at not energy consumption, but costs, we can look at, instead of the same climate zone, we can look at other buildings with the same kilowatt hour rate. In other words, how much does it cost per kilowatt hour? If you're benchmarking maintenance costs, we have found that using a filter where you're comparing buildings that where the electricians are paid the same hourly rate is a very accurate workaround. There are lots of filters like this, workaround filters you can use for every metric that you want to study. And the last misconception, a major one that people have, and there are impediments for people not getting started with benchmarking, is they think it's going to take forever to collect and input all the data. Well, the key takeaway here, and we'll talk more about it a little bit later, is you do not need to benchmark all the data from the get-go, the first day you start benchmarking. There are just a few key data points you need to put in, and we'll talk more about that. As I said, you want to start with what's most important, and then delve into more detail in the areas that are giving you problems, where your numbers are not as good as you'd like them to be. Okay, now let's identify those 6 critical components. And the first of them is to define your objectives. These you're going to get from those 2 slides I showed you on the stakeholders at the very beginning of this webinar. So those 2 slides, one was for the facility managers and the other is if you are an outside contractor or consultant. Define your objectives so you know what you're trying to study. The second component, and this is one that a lot of people just start right into this. They start looking for a perfect tool, and that's as far as they ever get, because I don't think the perfect tool really exists out there. They're always getting improved. So, but they're looking for the right benchmarking tool. And there's a lot of other objectives, as you're going to see in a moment. This is just the first part of the process. It's very important to have the right tool, but it's not the only thing that you need to have. So let's look at the other 4 critical components, and then we're going to come back on the next slide to look at the details of the requirements of getting the right benchmarking tool. You need to have enough buildings in your database, and I've spoken about that already. I'm not going to say anything more, but you can have the right tool, you can have your objectives defined, and if you don't have enough buildings in that database, you're not going to have a successful benchmarking implementation. But even with enough buildings, you're not going to be successful unless you can satisfy this 4th requirement, which is you need to know how to benchmark. Which filters should you turn on? Which should you swap out? How do you interpret your reports? You're going to learn that benchmarking is as much an art as a science. Okay, it's not just getting a hard number in a report. You have to have the right report. So you need that knowledge. But even then, your benchmarking will mean nothing to you if you do not implement the recommendations. We've seen people benchmark and then they get results and recommendations, but they don't do anything about it. If you don't implement anything, you're not going to improve. Okay? And even then, all you've done is you've done benchmarking for 1 year, you've got some improvement. You have to annually reassess. And I mentioned before why that's important, because benchmarking is a continuous improvement process. Okay, now let's look at how we define the right benchmarking tool. I have 4 areas identified on this slide. The first are having a tool that contains the metrics that you want to study, such as your maintenance costs, your staffing levels in different areas of FM, your space utilization rate, or how many square meters you have in your building. Those are the metrics, lots of them. A second are the filters, and you saw examples of filters on the previous slide, so we don't need to show any more about those, but it's important to have a tool that can parse the data by different filters. Third, you need to have the right reports so you can compare what you need to compare. I have a lot of examples of reports on the next slide, so we'll see those in a moment. And the 4th item on this slide is you need a system that is easy to use. Back when I was consulting to FMs over 20 years ago on getting software systems for helping to manage their facilities, every system out there said it was easy to use. Systems today are still saying that. But what is easy to use? So back then, I defined it in 3 ways, and I think those still apply today. So let me tell you what they are. The first is that the system must be obvious for doing what you want to do. So if you are going to want to generate a report for this or compare that or filter that, it's very obvious what you need to click on. Second, you want to have a minimal number of clicks to get to where you want to go. So it may be obvious of what to do, but if you're doing the same thing over and over, you don't want to have to spend 5 clicks every time you go there. You wish you could do it in 1. And the third way I define ease of use is even if it's just 1 click, you don't want to wait 5 to 10 seconds for that next screen to come up. So you need a system that is fast so that it can generate your next screen, whether it's a report or anything else you're looking at or a chart. You don't want to waste a lot of your time to sit there and look at the screen thinking. So which of these are most important will depend somewhat on your industry. With metrics, for example, hospitals may use the number of beds as a metric, or a retail store may use the number of linear meters of shelf space. Different things for different industries, but and they could become more important than square meters. So it really varies, but you have to define those for your industry. So now let's look at some of those reports. Okay, this list will be, this PowerPoint slide will be in your deck that gets sent to you, but this looks like a pretty simple list of reports, but it's not quite as simple as it looks. We see the first one, the area per occupant. That makes sense. But let's look at the second one. The second line is really 6 different reports on one line. We have your utility costs per occupant, your utility costs per unit area, like per square meter. We have your energy costs per occupant and per area, and your electricity costs per occupant and per area. So you can see there's a lot of different types of reports on this list, and that doesn't include applying the filters that you can apply to each report. So those are all examples of the reports. Now in this next section of this webinar, we're going to look at some examples from a real benchmarking system and look at some real results to see the value of filters. This is a schematic of a benchmarking report. So let me explain the way it works, because the reports I'm going to show you all follow this format. What we see here is a different vertical line being represented for each building in not the whole database, but just the filter set. It might be office buildings only or something like that. So it's just how we filtered the data. Each line's a different building, and our building is shown in this odd color here in the middle of the 3rd quartile. The results are divided into quartiles to make it easier for you to analyze. The better performing buildings are on the left because the vertical axis might be, say, the cost per square meter for maintenance or utilities or something like that. So you want the cost to be low. Your building is not doing as well. It is in the 3rd quartile. Okay, that's the general concept. Now let's look at a real graph with real data. This one is in cost per square foot, as you see here on the vertical axis, and it's looking at maintenance costs. You see a horizontal red line, which is always on these charts on the border of the 2nd and 3rd quartile. That is the median of all the results. You'll notice that we have a pretty smooth curve over here, which is reassuring. The smoother the curve, the more consistent the data is. Sometimes you see a curve jump in the fourth quartile or jump down in the first quartile. That's fine too. It really depends on the type of metric you are studying. Okay, as far as our building goes, let me blow that up. It's between these two arrows. So if I blow it up, you can start to see where this yellowish line is, and that's where our building is. It is in the fourth quartile. It is not great. If I extend this line over to the left, we see it's at about $3 per square foot for maintenance costs. So let's now see what we can do to make sure we have the right filter set. And you'll see the importance of that in a second. Okay, right now we're at about $3 a square foot. Our building is not doing well. We look down here at the bottom and we see that our filters are, it's not just office buildings, but it's those that are very large, over 600,000 gross square feet or about 60,000 square meters. Okay, so I realize that our building in this example is a very old building. So what if I were to filter out the newer buildings? What would we expect to see? Well, if we filter out the newer buildings, they probably cost less to maintain. They're going to be in this area. If I get rid of those buildings on the left, I am probably going to have my building, even though it still costs $3 a square foot, I'm probably going to have my building appear maybe more to the left. So let's see. I'm going to show you the next slide. I added that other filter. There are fewer buildings that are in the overall filter set because I got rid of some. But now we're in the third quartile and a much more accurate comparison for our building. That's the way you use filters. I can keep on turning on and off filters until I have what I think is the most accurate filter set. If my building is still way out here on the right side of this chart, then I know there's things I need to do to improve my building's performance. That is a way to use benchmarking. I'm going to show you one other chart which will look a little different. Let's look at this one. Here it looks backwards because here we are measuring the area cleaned per janitorial worker. So here the better performing buildings on the left have a higher number, which is why the chart looks backwards. What's also interesting is it's pretty flat. There's not much of a difference between the beginning of the second quartile and the end of the third quartile. But then it jumps down a fair amount at in the fourth quartile and goes up a lot in the first quartile. These are all very plausible types of results when you're dealing with cleaning. So a good benchmarking tool is going to show you that. Okay, let's look at some of the potential pitfalls in this next part of the presentation. Okay, the first one is that people spend a lot of time looking for the perfect benchmarking tool. I mentioned before, it may not exist because even if a tool, and the reason it doesn't exist is there's always ways to improve it, just like every piece of software that you have is constantly getting ways to improve over time. New metrics are being studied, new best practices are being identified, and so on. So there's a good tool is always improving. Okay, even if a tool cannot do everything you want, a good tool is going to give you many benefits that you are not getting now, and you will still come out much further ahead than if you did not benchmark at all. So that's pitfall number one. Number two is you have a tool that does not have enough buildings. We've spoken about that before, and I've mentioned that all your reports should have a minimum of 20 to 25 buildings in them to make the results meaningful. My rules of thumb on how many buildings you need in a database: if you're going to apply 3 filters at once, you usually will need about 1,000 buildings in your database. If you add one more filter, you will need to double that number, 2,000 buildings in your initial database. And for every other filter you add, you're going to need to double the number of buildings. 5 filters applied at the same time, therefore, would require around 4,000 buildings. So you need to get a tool, in my opinion, with at least 1,000 buildings in it, and then use your filters wisely, swapping them out if they are not doing anything for that report. So in those examples I showed you, if you apply a new filter and your building doesn't appear to move to the left or right, the filter probably is not an important one for that particular metric that you are studying. The last pitfall I want to mention is you try to do too much, especially at the start. You don't have to do it all on day one. Just because your benchmarking tool has a data field for a metric doesn't mean that you have to use it. For example, back in the old days of CAD and you had as-builts and you wanted them digitized, you, as a facility manager, did not really need to have electrical, phone outlets, lighting fixtures shown on every drawing. You do need them in areas that you're going to renovate, but you can just put those into your as-builts when you renovate a given space. You don't need to have it in all your spaces from the get-go. Similarly with benchmarking, you don't need it all on day one. When you're studying something in more depth, like your maintenance costs, at that point, if your maintenance costs are an issue for you, and you're not doing so well, then maybe it is important to find out where those euros are going in terms of whether they're spent on plumbers or electricians or carpenters and so on. So a key to remember is that 80% of the benchmarking benefit will result from just you're doing 20% of the work. So it's really not a big deal to get going with benchmarking. You can look at your total maintenance cost, your total janitorial cost, your square meters for the building, your total utility cost and consumption, your security cost. That's it to get started. That's kind of the bulk of what you're going to have. Okay, let's look at now how we can improve what we're doing, because we've been looking at how we compare our building to others, but we have not yet said a word about how we can use this benchmarking data to improve our performance. Okay, what the secret ingredient is here are best practices, and we need to apply best practices to reduce our costs, and that's how we get improved building performance. Let's go back to our schematic. If we keep the filters the same as in this schematic report, and here we are in the 3rd quartile, the question is, what can we do to improve this performance? And the way we attack that is we say, what are these buildings on the left doing differently in terms of best practices than what we are doing in our building? And that, very simply, is how we are going to improve. So now let's look at examples on how to do that. The first example is really a schematic. The data is not totally accurate. I'm just showing it to illustrate a concept. Here are 4 of many best practices that relate to utilities. The first one is having motion sensors in restrooms. Note that we have not implemented those four best practices in our building. That's why there's a no there. Okay. We are looking at now data for those in better performing buildings. We see that 73% of those in better performing buildings have implemented that best practice. We have not. And if we go to the best performing buildings, 75% have implemented it. So that tells us that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the others that are doing better than we are in utilities have implemented this best practice. If we look at the other three lines, what we see is a big difference between the better and best performing buildings. Okay, they're over 10% each. There's significant room for improvement here. So I would try to implement maybe some of these three first and then come back to this one later. And we can really hopefully see some improvement. And that's the way you can use best practices to improve. So now I'm going to show you one more slide where we see that happening in real life with real numbers. So let's look over here, and I want you to focus on just the top slide, the top part of the slide. We'll look at the second half later. But on the top half of the slide, let's hone in on the second line where it says motion sensors in general office space. We have not implemented it in our building. And let me just blow this up a little bit. Oops. So we see that on the second line, 68% of those in our quartile have not implemented that best practice, whereas 80% in the next better performing quartile, the second quartile, have implemented it. That's a significant difference, and the number 80% is a pretty good number. Maybe that's something I should implement in my building. I'll have to work out the cost to implement it and so on, but that gives me some very good clues as to what I might do in my building. But I am not done yet. So let's come back over here. And this was like we did before in the comparison charts for office buildings that were large, over 60,000 square feet. Now let's remember that ours is an old building. So let's get our more accurate filter set here by applying that filter to the best practice analysis. We come to that second line, the motion sensors in the general office space, and we're going to blow it up again down here. And we see that 72% in our quartile have implemented that, and I believe that is higher, than the 68% from without that filter applied. And here it jumps all the way up to 18% over here, so a delta of 16 between the two columns. And the 88 is certainly much higher than the 80%. I'm even more convinced than ever when I apply that filter that this is the right way to go. That's how you use filters and best practices to get some really good clues as to how you can improve. Okay, so that concludes the main part of the presentation. I'm going to speak for just less than a minute on FM benchmarking. My company will tell you just a little bit about it. It is a benchmarking tool, and then we'll have the Q&A right after that. But FM benchmarking has three what we call editions. A query edition, you don't have to put in any data. You don't get to see, therefore, your building on a report, but you can see all the other things on a report. It's good for when you're doing some what-if scenarios, or you're thinking of acquiring a new building and you want to have an idea of what it may cost to operate. It's useful for that purpose. The Starter Edition gives you not just your building, it will show your building in comparison to others, but it will also enable you to do best practice analysis, similarly to what you saw on those last few slides. So that's a key to improving that starter edition. The premium edition is going to give you many more data fields. So when you want to go into more depth, that will do it for you. It will also give you trend analysis. You can compare your reports from one year to the next. We don't believe that people need the premium edition to go into that kind of depth until they've been benchmarking 2 or 3 years. There's plenty for you to do with just the starter edition. But you can get the data from one to the other real easily. It's seamless. So you can switch over at any time, but do start with the starter edition. You can find out more at fmbenchmarking.com. There's also a little demo you can do to see the concept at that point. So I want to thank you very, very much for attending. You can see on this slide, here's how you can email me if you have any questions, either about the presentation or about FM benchmarking. Just don't hesitate to email. You can also see here how to find the ebook, and you're going to get a link from Renske in a little bit as well. So she's also going to send you the PowerPoint deck. Again, I thank you very, very much for tuning into this webinar. I hope you got a little information out of it that you can apply. And I'm now going to turn this over to Renske for the Q&A. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very, very much also you, Peter, for this interesting presentation. I'm very curious to see how people will use all the things and if they can use the success stories and the pitfalls so that we can all improve the facility management industry. Now let's move on to the Q&A.